Now, with the conditional content covered here, before we continue, I want to restructure the expenses component a little bit. And I actually want to extract that list logic into a new component to again make that expenses component a little bit leaner. Therefore, I'll add a expenses list.js file and also a expenses list.css file, which you also find attached. And you can already download my CSS file and copy the styles into your expenses list CSS file. In the expenses list.js file, I will then add a constant expenses list, which receives props and returns something. And of course, we export this expenses list. And we can, if we want to, also import React from React, but again, that is optional. Now here in expenses list, I want to output my expenses list. I will not filter in there. I will keep the filtering logic in expenses, since that's also where I manage the filtered year. But I will take this fallback content, this if check, I will take all of that and move that into my expenses list component. That means that we also, of course, want to import the expense item from /expense item here, since I'm using that component here. And the filtered expenses no longer exist here. I just want to get, let's say, my items here, or expenses. It's up to you. I'll name it items as props, like this. Now in expenses.js, that of course means that here I now want to output my expenses list down there. And of course, we therefore also want to import expenses list from the expenses list file. And we can get rid of the expense item import. And the filtered expenses should now be passed to expenses list through the items prop, which I'm using inside of expenses list, like this. Now, inside of the expenses list.js file, I also want to make a couple of changes now. Of course, we need to return some JSX, but I want to return an unordered list here and actually give that list a class name of expenses-list. This is a class defined here in my CSS file, and therefore we also want to import this expenses list CSS file into the expenses list.js file. And inside of this unordered list, I now want to output my map here, my expense item array. So I will again grab that and render this dynamically here like this. And I will handle this if case a little bit differently now. I will add a if check, but I'll check if props items length is equal to 0. So if we have no items, and if that's the case, I will simply return a totally different JSX snippet, because that's yet another way of handling conditional content. If what your component returns changes entirely based on different conditions, you can use this approach. It would have not been appropriate here in expenses.js before, because only a part of the JSX snippet which we returned changed. So there, the approach I showed in the last lecture was better. But if your entire JSX content changes when data is missing, you can also add a if check where you return a different JSX block if some condition is met. And here I simply want to return an h2 tag with a class name of expenses-list __ fallback with a text of found no expenses. So that's what this component, expenses list, will render if we got no expenses. Hence, we can also get rid of that variable here. And with that, we see this found no expenses text or the filtered list if we switch. But now, with help of this extra component, which uses a different logic for rendering or for returning different JSX code, and we now also got a little bit of a leaner expenses.js file again. Now, one additional tweak which I want to make here, which I almost forgot, is that since I'm using an unordered list here now, for semantic reasons in the expense item component, I actually want to switch away from having a div being rendered to a list item instead. So I will just wrap this entire card here with a list item. And visually, this doesn't change anything, but semantically, this is a little bit better. So that's just another tiny tweak which I wanted to make here. So this expense tracker has taken some shape, and it's basically finished from the core functionality, at least. We got all the core features implemented. We can add expenses, we can filter our expenses. But if you remember the original state, which I showed you a couple of hours ago, then there is one crucial element and feature which is missing: the chart, where we can actually see a graphical representation of our expenses per month. And that is therefore what we're now going to dive into to then conclude this module and this first course project. Now, for this chart, I will start by adding a new components folder, which I'll name chart, because it will hold all the components that are related to the chart. And I will split up the chart into two main components. For one, that's the chart itself, the chart component, which we can add to our application. But then inside of the chart, we have all these bars, and I will actually create a separate component for those, the chart bar component. So we'll have these two components, and we're also going to have some styles. So I'll already add a chart CSS and a chart bar.css file, and you find these two files attached. So as always, you can copy and paste the styles you find in there, or simply use these attached CSS files right away. And then let's start with the chart.js file, with the chart itself. There, I will import React from React, even though that's technically not required in this setup, but still. And then I'll create my chart functional component here, like this. So this component function, I should say, and export this like that. And now with that, in the chart, we of course want to render all these chart bars. And the question is now how we want to do that, how we want to structure the JSX code in this component, and how that all should work. Well, eventually we're going to import the chart bar component. At the moment it's of course empty, but we're soon going to add something there, and hence I can already add this import. And I then want to in the end return some JSX code where we have all these chart bars. So maybe we first of all set up a div with a class name of chart to apply that styling. And for that, we then also import chart CSS like this. Not chart bar, but chart CSS to apply the styles. But inside of the div, we now want to have the bars. And we could simply render 12 individual chart bars for the 12 months which we have. But I will actually create a bit of a more flexible chart, which is actually not necessarily restricted to months and to 12 data points. Instead, we could say that when the chart component is being used somewhere in our application, we want to receive the data points that should be plotted as props, so that the chart component is fairly configurable, and the components that use the chart component can decide how many data points with which values should be rendered. And therefore, I actually will output the chart bars dynamically by going through an array of data points and mapping every data point to a chart bar. And that's of course basically what we already learned in this module, how we output lists of content dynamically. And that's also why I'm doing it here, so that we again practice this. So on props, we could expect a data points prop. Of course, that name is up to you since it's your component, but I expect the data points prop. And I expect that to hold a value which is an array. Hence, we can call map on that, and then we map every single data point into a chart bar component, so that we create as many chart bar components as we have data points. And then, of course, we want to pass some data into the chart bar to control how it will be rendered, so which value will be rendered there. And for that, we of course want to extract some data from the incoming data points. Now, up to this point, we're never using the chart component, so we as the creator of this component can define which kind of data we expect to extract there in the future. And for example, we could say that the chart bar component should receive a value prop, and there we want to pass data point.value. Of course, that will require that in the chart bar, we then read this prop, and that when we define the data points later, that every data point has a value property. So that a data point is an object which has a value property. That's what we're basically defining now, since that is how we want to use that chart component and the chart bar component in there. Now, I also want to make sure that every chart bar plots the value in relation to the maximum value in the entire chart. And therefore, I also want to pass in a max value property, and that is currently null, let's say. That's not data which we extract from the data point, because that is a unique value which is the same for all chart bars in a given chart. So we will need to derive this max value, and we'll do this in a second. For the moment, I'll set this to null, but that's just a temporary value. We probably also want to have a label, though. For example, in this case, to have a label of January, February, March, April, and so on. And therefore, I'll add a label prop and pass in data point.label, like that. And since we're mapping this, since we're outputting a list here, we also should add a key, because you learned that this special key prop helps React render these list items efficiently. And therefore, I do expect that every data point also has a unique ID. Or maybe we actually use the label, so that we say that the label should be unique. Every chart bar has its own unique label, and therefore we can also use the label as a unique identifier for this special key prop here. That looks good to me. Now, of course, we want to continue working on the chart bar to bring that to life. Now, to build the chart bar component, we again want to import React from React in there, and then import the CSS file, of course, so that we have these styles available. And then we can define our component function, chart bar, and set this equal to props, and then simply return our JSX code here. And we will definitely need props, because we are already defining some props here in the chart component. Of course, we also want to export chart bar as a default here. Now, for this JSX code in the chart bar, which we return, I want to have a div here with a class name of chart-bar, since that's one of the CSS styles defined in the CSS file. And in there, then another nested div with a class name of chart_bar__inner. And these divs and CSS classes are simply required to make the provided styles work. Now in there, I will add yet another div with a class name of chart-bar__fill. And then next to that div, so not nested, but next to it, I'll add another div with a class name of chart-bar__label. And actually, that should not be in the inner div, but side by side to the inner div. So that this is the structure we have here. A bunch of divs which will then be responsible for rendering this chart correctly. However, like this, we wouldn't see much. For one, I of course want to output the label which we receive on the label prop. And that's why I added this div. There we can dynamically output props.label so that the label is visible. But we also will need to change this chart bar fill div here. This div is required to basically remember by how much this chart bar will be filled. And this chart bar fill CSS class will, for example, define the background color for that. But one important piece of information is missing in the CSS class, and that will be the height of this filled chart bar. The overall chart bar has a predefined height, 100% of the parent container, which is the chart, which has a height of 10 rem. But of course, by how much we fill that bar depends on the data we're receiving. So it depends on the value, because we want to basically fill our chart bar by putting the value in relation with the max value. So that if the max value for the entire chart is 100 and the value for a given chart bar is 50, we fill that chart bar by 50%. And therefore, in the chart bar component, we now need to calculate by how much this specific chart bar instance should be filled. For this, we can add a variable, which we could name bar fill height, but the name is up to you. And initially, I'll set this to 0% as a text, because this will be assigned as a CSS style in a second. So it's 0% like this. But then I want to check if we got a max value greater than 0, so that for the given data points, we do have a max value greater than 0. We could have 0 later if we filter for a month that has no expenses. So we want to check if we do have a max value greater than 0. And if that's the case, I want to set bar fill height equal to moth round, and then in nested brackets, props value divided by props max value times 100. This will basically give us the percentage between 0 and 100 by which this bar should be filled. And I'm rounding to the nearest integer here. And we also want to convert this to a string with the percentage sign at the end, so I will add plus percentage here, like this. And now we want to set this as the height, as the CSS style height for this div with the chart bar fill class name. And to achieve this, we're going to do something which we haven't done thus far in this course. We're going to set the style of an element dynamically. And that can be done by adding the style prop here, which is of course a default HTML attribute as well. But actually that style prop, that style attribute, works a little bit differently when building a React application. The value we set here should be dynamic, because it should be our derived fill height here. And indeed, you then don't generate a dynamic string where you set something like height 10%, but instead, style, and that's the special thing, wants an object. So here we don't have a special double curly brace syntax, but instead we have the single curly braces for outputting something dynamically, but then the dynamic value is a JavaScript object, which is also created with curly braces. That's why we overall have the double curly braces, but it's no special style syntax. The only special thing here is that style wants a JavaScript object as a value. And in this object, you should then use the CSS property names as key names, as properties, and the values as, well, values. So for example here, we can then set background color to a given value, or in our case, we can set height to bar fill height. Now, as a side note, if you have something like background color with a dash, you need the quotes around the property name, because otherwise it would be an invalid property name. Or better, you use the camel case version of that name, background color like this. We don't need the background color here, but I want to show this to you. I will come back to this later as well in the course, but that is how you would target such CSS property names which have a dash inside of them if you are setting the style prop on an element. But here we don't even need that, so I will get rid of it. We only need to set the height. And with that, we also finished the chart bar component. Now we just need to use the chart and pass in the data points. So now to use the chart and pass in the data points, I will add a new component in the expenses components folder, and I'll name it expenses chart.js. And here we don't even need a CSS file, but I will import React from React to be in line with my other files and create the component function expenses chart. There I expect to get some props and we export this. So basically what we always do. Now in here, the goal is to overall return the chart. So here we want to return the chart, and therefore you should make sure that you also add the import to this chart component in the chart folder like this. But now we need to define the data points which are passed into the chart, because there we are referring to this data points prop. And to set up the data points here in expenses chart, I will actually create a new constant here and name it chart data points. And this will be an array. And in this array, I want to have a bunch of objects, because we expect every data point to be an object. In the chart.js file, when we map through data points, we then access values like label and value on the given data point. So therefore, we want to have objects, and these objects should have a label and a value key. Now the value is simply 0 initially for every data point, and the label is something like Jan for January. But then I'm going to duplicate this and set up the Feb data point, which also initially is 0. And I'll repeat this for the entire year and have a March, April, May, June, July, and so on. Also have August and September and October, and then have November and December, so that we have all these data points, which in their initial state all have a value of 0. Now, of course, we're not done here. We don't want to have 0 for every data point. Instead, now we want to have a look at our filtered expenses and make sure that we basically go through all the expenses for a selected year, and that we then sum up the expenses for all the different months and we assign them here to our data points. So therefore, I expect to get the filtered expenses as a prop on my expenses chart component, because we will use expenses chart in the expenses.js file later, and there we have the filtered expenses. So here in expenses chart, I just expect to get that list of expenses. And then we can add a for loop where we loop through all our expenses, which we get via props. And then we want to have a look at every expense, get the month of that expense, and update the value of the appropriate data point by the expense amount. So here we can get our expense month inside of that loop by having a look at expense.date get month. Date is a date object, and there we have the built-in get month method, which returns us that month, starting at 0 though, so January is 0. But we can then use this month later to pick the right data point, since January has the index 0 in this array as well. So we can basically use the month as an index in that array later. And later is actually now. I will reach out to my chart data points for the given month. Again, this starts at 0 and ends at 11, which is exactly the case for the index of these data points. So we can use that as an index. And I want to update the value of the selected data point by adding something to it with that plus equal shortcut operator. And I want to add the expense amount, so that we increase the value of a given month by that expense amount. And we go through all expenses to sum up all the expenses for the different months and assign the values to the appropriate months, to the appropriate data points here. So that after this for loop, we still have this array, but now the values will not be 0 anymore, but instead they will have the summed up values for the given month expenses. And now we can pass these data points to the chart. There we set the data points prop, since that's the prop we're expecting there, data points. And we set this equal to our updated chart data points. And this should do the trick. Now we're still not done. We now also want to go back to the chart. And there you might remember that we also need to calculate the total max value. So we want to have a look at all the months and find the biggest value across all months, because that's the maximum value which should be represented in the chart. And to do this, we can add a new constant, total maximum. The name is up to you. And here we can use math_max to find the maximum value. But actually max wants a number of arguments like this. So comma separated arguments, comma separated numbers, for which it then returns the biggest number. Here we have an array though, and also not an array of numbers, but an array of objects. And we're just interested in a specific property of that object. Nonetheless, we can work around that. We can get our value array, if we want to call it like this, or our data point values. And here we can simply call props data points dot map to call the map method. But now we won't map the data points into JSX elements, but instead simply transform them from objects to numbers. So that for every data point, we in the end just return data point dot value. So that means that we transform a data point object to just a number, the number stored in data point value. And therefore map here on data points will return a brand new array, which is just an array of numbers, an array of all these values for all these data points we're getting. So in our case, for the 12 months, we'll have an array of 12 values. And now it's the data point values where we want to find the maximum, but since max wants a list of arguments instead of an array, and since this still is an array, data point values still is an array, we can use the spread operator here to pull out all the array elements and add them as standalone arguments to this max method. So now this max method will receive 12 arguments, which are these 12 values from our array, pulled out by this spread operator. And now it's this total maximum, which I pass in here as a max value. And with that, that's also updated. And now we just want to make sure that we use our expenses chart component. And I want to do that in the expenses.js file. There we can import expenses chart from expenses chart like this. And we now simply add that here between the filter and the list. We render our expenses chart. And of course, very important now, we need to pass in the expenses prop because that is expected in the expenses chart component. So here I'll set expenses equal to my filtered expenses, because of course I only want to chart the currently filtered expenses. And with all of that, we should be done, except that I'm getting an error here. Cannot read property get month of undefined. And that's simply happening because here in the expenses chart component, I'm using a for in loop. Of course, it should be a for off loop since expenses, props expenses, is an array, not an object. So for off is correct to loop for all the items. And now this is looking better. Now, what we see though, or what we don't see is somehow we don't have any fill values. No matter how I switch, we never see any of the bars being filled. But the reason for that is that in the chart bar component, I'm checking props max for being greater than 0. Well, I actually named the prop max value though. So we should also check props max value here. And now this looks better. Now we see that this looks good, and now we got certain bars which are filled, others which are not filled, simply depending on what we're filtering for. And this is now the finished expenses tracker. Of course, feel free to play around with it, to tweak it, to add more features and experiment with it. But we're also going to have more projects in this course, and we're also going to dive deeper into React. For example, we are also going to take a closer look at styling React components and how we can scope styles to components. Because actually, right now I can tell you all the styles we set up, even though the CSS files have component-specific file names, all CSS styles actually up to this point are global. If a class is defined here in the chartbar CSS file, we could add this CSS class to any element in any component and the styles would be applied. Currently, these styles are not scoped, and therefore that's one topic we're also going to take a closer look at throughout the next modules, but of course also plenty of other core React features.